All right. It's your boy, Mehran, coming to you live again from Venice Beach, Test Max headquarters. Today, we're here to discuss sufficient and necessary condition. So, as usual, we'll get started. For those of you who missed last week, remember that the replay is now live on YouTube. So you can check out our YouTube channel, LSAT Max, catch last week's Q&A on logic games, as well as the previous Q&As that we did on digital LSAT, as well as LSAT prep strategies. And while we have been going every week, we will not be here next week. And so it's possible we'll be back for the week of August 22nd, but most likely we'll probably save it for August 29th and do a Q&A on whether you should keep your score or cancel it, because as most of you know, the July LSAT scores are being released on August 28th. So I think going live the day after that might be useful for some of you guys who took that exam. So before we get started, as usual, right, I did want to let you guys know, if you have any questions, if we can help in any way, shoot us a text, right? Just shoot LSAT to 310-818-7743, and you can get in touch with us and chat with us about anything. Any questions, concerns, struggles you're having with your LSAT prep, we are happy to help. Now, in terms of questions today, please remember, guys, use the questions feature so we can highlight them for people. And another thing is, if you haven't, please make sure you take a moment to download LSAT Max. This is what the app looks like for free users. All of the colored icons indicate free content. You can also download Practice LSATs by LSAT Max. This is just the digital LSAT simulator. Also comes with a free Practice LSAT. If you wanted to see what our digital LSAT simulator looks like, there you have it. So definitely take advantage of that if you haven't already. And if you wanted to purchase, right, you remember from the left menu, tap store, and you can buy any of these exams a la carte, right, without having to buy our course. So if you're looking for a way to simulate digital LSATs, again, LSAT does offer the three free digital LSATs, 71, 72, and 73. Our June 2007 LSAT is also free, but if you want more, we do make them available without any requirement that you buy our course. So today we're going to discuss the bane of what seems like every pre-law student's existence, and anyone who's really preparing for the LSAT, which is sufficient and necessary conditions. And the reason we decided to do this is obviously we've seen a lot of questions consistently over the past few weeks as we've done these Q&As about sufficient and necessary. So I thought, given the fact that it is foundational, we should review it to make sure that everybody is super clear on the idea of sufficient and necessary conditions. So let's take a look. We have upgraded from cards to tablets. So this is the idea of sufficient and necessary conditions, right? I'm sure everyone who's been preparing for the LSAT is familiar with what this is, right? This is a diagram of a general principle, right, which is what sufficient and necessary is talking about. The S obviously being my sufficient condition, the N being my necessary condition, right? So again, so as you see here, as you look at this, below that is what is known as the contrapositive, right? The idea being that if you remove the necessary condition, the sufficient condition also disappears, right? And that's what you're seeing here, right? And again, just to make it clear, if you get rid of necessary, we then know we don't have sufficient. And so just like up here, if we have sufficient, we follow this arrow, we know we have necessary, right? And so that's the idea. The sufficient condition is enough to prove something else. Its existence is enough to prove the necessary condition exists, right? Okay. So if the necessary condition is necessary for the existence of the sufficient condition, if you take that necessary condition away, you get rid of the sufficient condition. So the idea is that the necessary condition, if it's not true, if it doesn't exist, it's also enough to tell us something else, right? That sufficient is not present, right? And so again, this idea of the contrapositive is really important, right? Anytime you encounter a sufficient and necessary statement on the LSAT, you want to diagram it, and then you want to draw the contrapositive. And the contrapositive is reverse and negate. Okay? So you notice here we reversed it and then negated it. Okay? And so every time, that should be second nature to any of you out there taking the LSAT, preparing for the LSAT. You diagram a general principle, you're going to write the contrapositive, right? And so that's what's happening on this screen here. Okay? So let's think about that a little bit. If you noticed in my example, it was the sufficient condition, right, that is leading you to a deduction, right? It was the sufficient condition that led me to conclude that the necessary condition is present, right? And that's the idea of why we want to focus on sufficient. Sufficient is your friend. It's like Starboy. He's there to help you. Wants to see you be successful. Wants to help you figure out what's going on. And so the sufficient condition is going to lead you somewhere. You're going to follow this arrow. It's going to take you somewhere. The necessary condition is not your friend. Necessary condition is going to mislead you if you try to rely on him for information. Right? It's fake news, as they would say. Necessary condition is fake news. Sufficient is your friend. Right? So that's the idea here. You are looking for sufficient conditions because that is going to allow you then to make deductions, right? You're going to make a conclusion. If sufficient exists, I know 100% that necessary exists. And that's the idea, right? So let's do some examples that might help put this abstract concept into perspective, right? Now, the nice thing about going through society and every law that you encounter basically is a general principle, right? It applies conditionally, right? Whether you invoke what it's saying or you don't, right? And so a couple of examples that I think we can all relate to. If you are able to purchase alcohol legally, you must be above the age, or you must be 21, right? At least 21 years old, right? Great. So you notice in that example, if I'm able to purchase alcohol legally, that would be my sufficient condition. Purchasing alcohol legally, that would lead to the deduction, the conclusion, that I am also at least 21 years old. Great. Another example. If I'm accepted to law school, it would be necessary that I apply to law school, right? Last I heard, they just don't show up at your door and welcome you to law school without your application. Maybe it's possible. But generally speaking, that in order to be accepted to law school, you must apply, right? So if you've been accepted to law school, that allows us to conclude with 100% certainty that you applied to law school, right? And the last one here, what about the idea if you're president of the United States, right? Being president of the United States has some requirements. One of which is that you are at least 35 years old. So there's something I can tell you for sure about Donald Trump. He's at least 35 years old, right? And that's the idea of sufficient and necessary. Now let's talk about the contrapositive, right? Because the idea here is that these general principles apply to two groups of people, each one of them, right? So let's go back through them one at a time. So first, we had this idea of being able to purchase alcohol legally. So if I'm able to purchase alcohol legally, I know I'm over the age, I'm 21 or older, right? I know that for sure. Okay, so that applies to everybody who can purchase alcohol legally. It also applies to anybody who's under the age of 21, the contrapositive. Because if you're under the age of 21, right, if the necessary condition is removed, we're going to know you can't legally buy alcohol, right? So you notice that principle applied to two groups of people. If you can buy alcohol legally and being under the age of 21. Next example. If you are accepted to law school, you must have applied. That applies to people who have been accepted to law school. We know that they applied. But it also applies to the group of people who didn't apply to law school because the contrapositive allows us to conclude that they didn't get accepted to law school. Right? And I appreciate the hearts, guys. If it's making sense, let me know. Right? If you have questions, drop them in there. Okay? Last example, right? If I'm president of the United States, I know I'm at least 35 years old. It applies to presidents. And it also applies to people under the age of 35. Because if you're under the age of 35, I know you can't be president, right? And so that's the idea here, right? And so, if you wanted to see that example, sufficient, what that would look like in terms of the president one, here you go, right? If you are president, we know that you are 35 years of age, at least 35 years of age. Contrapositive, we negate being at least 35 years of age, and that's why it's now we are less than 35 years old, right? We know you can't be president, okay? And so again, that's the idea of sufficient and necessary from a very high level. So now let's keep moving, right? Because again, I want to keep it clear what we're doing with sufficient and necessary. We're looking for what we can conclude with 100% certainty, and I think that's really important to keep in mind. This is not a discussion about what might be true, what could be true, right? This is a discussion about what must be true. So notice, it's possible that if you found somebody on the street that was over the age of 35, that person is president, right? There's one possibility. In terms of current presidents, right? If we're going back, obviously any living president would satisfy that same rule, right? It's a possibility that if you encounter someone who's over the age of 35, they are president. And possibly ran into Donald Trump today, right? But could we say with 100% certainty just based on that characteristic of being over the age of 35? And the answer is no, right? The answer is no. Same idea, right? Same idea that it's possible, right? That you purchase alcohol legally, or technically legally. You have fake ID, you go in the store, you buy alcohol. It's possible you're not 21 years old, 21 years or older, right? But that's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about what we can conclude with 100% certainty. Well, Alex, when you say what age did you decide to pursue law? Technically, I didn't pursue law. I went to law school. I don't actually practice. So I think I've never made the decision to pursue law. I chose to put, your guys' pursuit of that dream, make it my career. I really enjoy teaching, LSAT prep, and standardized prep in general. I think, helping students achieve their goals is really something that makes us proud. So, I think that's my calling, and I'll stick with it for, hopefully I don't have to practice law. But so digressing, getting back to, what we were talking about here, right? So we're talking about what we can conclude with 100% certainty. So remember, there's two things going on here. Two things. Positive argument structure. Okay, this is the idea that if I'm president, I can conclude with 100% certainty that I'm at least 35 years old. So remember that, right? Let's go back one page, okay? So you notice, let's take this example and plug it into this SNN here, okay? What this circle means, right, is that sufficient exists. The idea that I am president. Pretend this is Donald Trump. I had a mask on. I got the orange tan going, right? I'm Donald Trump. I'm standing in front of you. We can say with 100% certainty, right, that I'm 35 years old. At least 35 years old, right? And that's the idea. So if sufficient exists, because again, this is a conditional statement. It doesn't apply until we invoke it. Now we've invoked it by saying Donald Trump is standing in front of you. Well, we can conclude this man is 35 years old. At least 35 years old, right? Obviously, he's a lot older than that. But at least 35 years old. And that's the positive argument structure, right? And we can do that with every single conditional statement that we encounter, okay? So again, I just want you to notice that what's happening here. I'm invoking sufficient to conclude necessary, okay? Invoking sufficient to conclude necessary. Now, as you can imagine, we can do that same thing with the contrapositive, which again is what we talked about if you're not 35 years old, right? If you're 34 years old, we know that you cannot be president, right? And that's what's going on with the contrapositive argument structure. But again, notice, you're invoking the sufficient condition of your contrapositive to conclude the necessary condition of your contrapositive, right? And that brings us to a remarkable rule that you can apply in your LSAT prep. you can only conclude necessary conditions. Think about that again. I invoke sufficient, conclude necessary. I'm never concluding the sufficient condition, right? This arrow is a one-way street. If you go the other way, you're going to get in trouble, right? Do not rely on the necessary condition to tell you anything, right? And if you guys remember from last week, give me 1 second here, let me jump over here. That was the idea that we had with not both either or, right? When we were thinking about what are the possibilities, and remember, we looked at what the necessary condition was to figure out what's possible. And remember, for not both, it's possible that neither are present, right? For either or, it was possible that both are present, right? Because again, the necessary condition is not your friend. It's not going to inform you of what's going on. The sufficient condition is your friend. Starboard. Okay? And so that should be your focus on these ideas. So again, only two valid ways to correctly apply a general principle. Invoke sufficient to conclude necessary, positive argument structure. Invoke the sufficient condition of the contrapositive to conclude the sufficient condition of the, to conclude the necessary condition of the contrapositive, right? All right. So obviously these arrows can follow, right? This is the idea of the transitive property. If I know all A's are B's, and I also know all B's are C's and all C's are D's, I'm going to create this chain, which allows me to conclude all A's are D. Right? And now below that is a contrapositive that just takes it back reverse, right? And so the transitive property is also something to be very aware of as you progress, because that's where you'll see the must be true questions. Well, they'll give you a lot of different conditional statements. You have to tie them then together, right? And so, Hasina, when you say I don't get the transitive property, you really just want to think about it as a game, right? And this is why we talk about diagramming, right? If you can get these statements in a vacuum, A, then B, B, then C, C, then D, you're just going to say, oh, if I have A, then I know I have B. Well, then when you look at another statement, you're going to say, oh, I have B. Well, then I know I have C. If you find the last statement, I know if I have C, then I have D. That's literally all you're doing. Follow the arrows. Look for the variables that are in common, right? And make sure that what they're sharing is sufficient, right? That lets you keep going, right? Notice here, if I had a condition then, let's say I had a different condition that said all E's are D, right? So E arrow D. And I got from C to D here, I can't go back then and conclude that E exists, right? The arrow is a one-way street. Remember that. Ingrain it into your mind, right? Don't just reverse. Don't just negate, right? The contrapositive is reverse and negate, right? And one other thing to just be aware of, remember, in terms of and or, if you reverse or and negate it, it becomes and, right? You reverse and negate it, it becomes or, right? So just keep that in mind in terms of the compound conditions. Okay, so I think that's a good overview so far of the general idea of sufficient and necessary. Let's see. So what we have going on with the questions. How do you always know what goes in the necessary and sufficient spots of an if-then? Well, this is a great transition, right, into the next part. So now we've talked about these discussions in the abstract. We've talked about these ideas in the abstract, right? Now we want to talk about it in terms of how it's going to apply on the LSAT. And the idea is that you're going to encounter conditional statements. But due to the imperfection of the English language, you can state the same logical statement in a lot of different ways. And so let's go back to our precedent example. Okay? You notice, logically, these statements are identical. They would be diagrammed just like we diagrammed it when we started talking about this example. Okay? And so this is where we talk about the trigger words. And notice that the trigger words are in red and underlined here. Because the first step for your success on sufficient and necessary is committing the rules of the keyword indicators to memory. And if then is the easiest one. If S, then N. So what follows if is my sufficient condition. The other part is my necessary condition, right? You can restate this in if then very easily as well. If I am president, then I must be at least 35 years old, right? And so again, the idea being, sorry guys, those would all be diagrammed in the same way. And that's the beauty of being able to extract the formal logic from the language of the LSAT. We know in a vacuum, 2 plus 2 is always 4, right? We know the rules of sufficient and necessary. We know the positive argument structure. We know the contrapositive argument structure. We know the transitive property. We know that we don't just reverse. We know that we don't just negate. And with those rules, if we can diagram, extract the pure logic correctly, you're going to find the right answer. So the first part of it is going over those keyword indicators. Okay. Now, we had a question specifically about unless, and so I want to direct everybody to this last line here, which says you cannot become president until you are at least 35 years old. Because until is just like unless, right? It's the temporal version. Okay, so this until is going to be treated the same way as unless. And so what happens with unless? Unless formula has two parts. The first part is it introduces the necessary condition. So the necessary condition is going to be that I'm at least 35 years old. Boom. Necessary condition, at least 35 years old. Now, the second part of the unless formula is that the other part of the statement, which is you cannot become president, the negation of that statement, that part of the statement, is going to be your sufficient condition. So you cannot become president will become you can become president. Boom. President. Sufficient condition, right? And that's the idea of how to diagram unless, until, without, right? They're all the same, okay? And so that part of it I feel is very straightforward, right? Now, don't get me wrong, you're going to not be moving as quickly as you would like as you start to learn these rules and try to apply it, right? You're going to hesitate, you're going to pause. It's completely natural, right? We tell students to diagram, again, so let's clarify. When we say we tell students to diagram everything, we mean if you encounter sufficient and necessary terminology, you should absolutely be diagramming everything while you're starting. Now, it's possible that by the time your exam rolls around, because you've been working so hard, you've been using LSAT Max, you've been checking out our Instagram live Q&As, you know that if president at least 35, if someone tells me if I'm at least 35, if someone tries to say I'm 40, therefore I'm president, I don't need to diagram that to say that's they're reversing and mistaking necessary for sufficient, right? And so I think that's something that's really important to consider, right? Now, I think what gets challenging for students beyond the keyword indicators are when you don't have the keyword indicator, right? And so here would be some examples of sufficient and necessary statements that don't have your traditional keyword indicator. So what are we looking for? How do we know that these are sufficient and necessary statements, right? The idea is, again, these are conditional statements. And if you can frame it as if then, that's a good sign, right? So let's start with the bottom one. Cats have quick reflexes. What is that telling us, right? What is that telling us? It's telling us that if cat, we know it's going to have quick reflexes, right? And so that is sufficient and necessary, right? The condition of cat allows you to say something else about the creature, right? The top one, haters will invariably hate. What does that tell us? If you're a hater, you're going to hate. That's what they do, right? So you notice here, again, even though you don't see the traditional keyword indicators, this is still conditional language, right? And yes, I think obviously this is more complicated, but these examples are much rarer. For the most part, you do get the keyword indicators, right? So definitely spend the time to commit those to memory, right? Remember, if you just need help with sufficient and necessary, you can in-app purchase our sufficient and necessary lesson and homework assignment. The lesson's over 2.5 hours long. The homework assignment is 50 real LSAT questions with explanations on sufficient and necessary, and that is $39.99, so $40 in-app purchase from the App Store. So if you're struggling and you need some more help, I would definitely recommend checking that out. So let's see what else is going on here. Are we going to delve into anything deeper than basic principles of sufficient and necessary? Well, great question, Shannon. Anything particular on your mind? I definitely have some more things coming up here. Because we've definitely got a lot of questions about strengthen with necessary, strengthen with sufficient. So that is definitely coming. So we're going to talk about that. But the one thing that I think is important, so if you guys wanted to get an example of what this kind of looks like in terms of an LSAT question, right? This is a strengthen with sufficient premise question. It's actually the 6th question from the first logical reasoning section of the free practice LSAT. So if you haven't seen this, you can definitely go check it out, watch the video explanation. But this is our missing premise drill taken out of the abstract and put in reality, right? If you notice here, if you just were looking up here at what the stimulus said, you notice that they try to invoke FC to arrive at the conclusion of EA, right? And so that's all that's happening on the missing premise, right? The idea is that there's a jump in the argument, and we're just closing that gap. And obviously, how are you closing that gap? You're closing that gap with the transitive property. You're connecting the conditions, right? So that's definitely something to check out if you haven't had a chance. If you wanted to see, for example, how these concepts manifest, if you're just getting started with your LSAT prep, great place to start. Now, let's see what else is going on. How does a person learn all this? Best place to start is LSAT Max. Our course is obviously comprehensive, but you can just get the sufficient and necessary lesson as we just discussed, right? But you basically are looking for a resource that will go over all of these concepts with you. So what kind of logical reasoning most likely to benefit from diagram? Well, so, I mean, obviously it can appear on all different types. I think the most common ones are must be true questions, where they give you a bunch of conditional statements and then the conclusion that they're hoping you'll make is the transitive property, right? That's very common. Obviously sufficient, strengthen with sufficient, strengthen with necessary, the assumption questions, which is the most common, strengthen with necessary is the most common question type that appears on logical reasoning. So that's really important there. And then obviously with the parallel reasonings, right? Both flawed and not flawed, right? But the other thing to remember, so let's take it a step further, because obviously principal questions, right? Principal questions have become more popular. The idea, they give you a general principle in the stimulus, and then the question is asking which of the following best illustrates the principle set forth, right? And so going back to the trick that I just talked about with you guys, it's not a trick. It's a rule of formal logic, right? You cannot conclude the sufficient condition, right? So if I had an example of a principal question that in the stimulus told me that if I can purchase alcohol legally, I'm above the age of 21, right? Or 21 or older. And I had answer choices A, B, C, and D, and all of those concluded that so-and-so can purchase alcohol legally. I would eliminate all of them without thinking twice, because that is the sufficient condition, and you can never conclude the sufficient condition. You invoke sufficient to conclude necessary. So definitely, those are probably the most common ones to be on the lookout for in terms of the types. So, Shannon, in terms of quantifier statements, you can absolutely reverse quantifiers, right? Just remember, but you can't reverse most and keep it most, it has to become some. So for example, these are great examples, right? Most Supreme Court justices are graduates of Harvard Law School. I wouldn't be able to say that most graduates of Harvard Law School are Supreme Court justices, right? It wouldn't make any sense. But I could say that some graduates of Harvard Law School are Supreme Court justices, right? So yes, they're definitely reversible, but just remember most becomes some. So now what I think we should dive into is the difference between strengthened with sufficient and strengthened with necessary. The assumption questions, right? And so I think the problem students have is you can't make the distinction based on the presence of the word assumption. And I'm going to go over some examples here with you guys to emphasize that, right? It's more than just the presence of the word assume, right? And I can show you why. So here's our first example. For the argument to be logically correct, it must make which one of the following assumptions? All right, so let's take a look at it, right? You notice it has the word assumption. Great. That's not what's going to help me understand what it is. What's going to help me understand the type of question this is the word must. Because must is a necessary condition. And so that is what tells me that this is a strengthened with necessary question. Okay? All right. Next example. Which one of the following is an assumption on which the explanation above depends? And you notice again, its assumption is present here. But it's not the word assumption that's telling me what type of strengthened question it is. It is depend. Because depends indicates necessary. Right? Exactly. Anna Ruthless, I like it. It's definitely strengthened with necessary because again, depends is a necessary, introduces necessary, right? All right. The argument requires the assumption that. Requires. We know requires is necessary. So again, this would be another example of a strengthened with necessary premise. Right? The position taken above presupposes which one of the following? This one doesn't even have the word assumption in it, right? But presupposes, that's a necessary condition, right? So this again would be a strengthened with necessary premise question. And so now let's compare this to strengthened with sufficient. The conclusion follows logically from the premises if which of the following is assumed. So I want to focus your attention on a couple things. First, follows logically. Follows logically basically means it must be true, right? We can conclude it with 100% certainty, right? And then I want to point your attention to the word if, because we know if introduces sufficient. And so lo and behold, this is a strengthened with sufficient premise question. Now remember, look, this also had the word assumed, right? Just like all the examples, except for the presupposes one, right? All the examples that I just did of strengthened with necessary all had the word assumption or assumed as well. So you're not basing it off the presence of the word assumption. And why not? Remember, guys, what does a premise, what does assumption mean? It just means unstated premise. That could be either an unstated sufficient premise or an unstated necessary premise, right? Either one works. And so that's why you do not want to base it on solely the presence of the word assumption. Okay, let's do a couple more here. Which one of the following is an assumption that would permit the conclusion above to be properly drawn? Again, notice, would permit to be properly drawn. This again is a strengthened with sufficient premise question. Again, properly drawn is talking about being enough, sufficient to allow the conclusion to follow logically, to be properly drawn, right? Which one of the following is an assumption that would serve to justify the conclusion above? Serve to justify. That's a super premise. The one that 100% guarantees the conclusion, right? Which one of the following is an assumption that would make the conclusion in the passage a logical one? Notice, would make a logical one. Again, this is saying find the answer choice that makes this follow logically. That is strengthened with sufficient, right? Oh. Where were we? So these are reverse. I think we're here, right? Yes, bam, bam. Going the wrong way, but we're coming back. Sorry, guys. When things are reversed, right? It can be a little bit trickier. All right, here we go. Logical. All right, right? So, okay, now. So we've gone over those examples. So again, I just want to emphasize, right? You're looking for necessary terminology for strengthen with necessary, right? The idea of presupposes, only if, unless, right? For strengthen with sufficient, we're focusing on stuff like follows logically, if, right? Properly drawn. But now what happens if you just encounter something like this? The reasoning in the passage assumes which of the following. Just comes out and says assumes. This is going to be a strengthen with necessary question, right? So when you see this by itself, you don't have anything else to point to. Yes, that's correct. That would be a strengthen with necessary assumption, right? And here's another example. The argument above makes which one of the following assumptions? Just flat out comes and says makes which one of the following assumptions? That is going to be a strengthen with necessary premise question, right? And so that in that case, so the idea here is I think you can't base it just off the presence of assumption, the word assumption, right? Because both strengthen and necessary and strengthen sufficient have the word assume or assumption present. But if you only see the word assume or assumption, then it is going to be a strengthen with necessary condition, right? And so that's the idea there. So in terms of questions, all right, let's see. Shannon, sorry for a little off topic. Do you know if they have fixed the glitch issues with highlighting, underlining on the tablets for digital LSAT? So, it's funny because we've been getting reports about this too, where people think that the app isn't working, or our app isn't working, which I think there's a misconception about how the technology works, right? You have to exert pressure to get it to work, right? You can't just drag your finger on the screen and think that it's going to pick up that you're touching it, right? So make sure that you're exerting pressure to take advantage of that feature. I'm assuming, given what we're seeing with our students in our app, that maybe it wasn't a glitch and it was just people not understanding that you have to exert pressure because it's the touch, right? That lets the screen know what's happening. But I haven't heard. Uma, what is the difference between strengthen and normal necessary? Okay, so great. So now we've talked a little bit about the difference between identifying the difference between strengthen with necessary, strengthen with sufficient. But now let's talk about the difference between the concepts of the premises, right? The example that I use in the course is a little bit outdated, so we're going to bring it to the modern day, and we'll use another example as well that I think you'll relate to. So first, let's start with the one that everyone can relate to, the idea of being accepted to law school. Okay, so what is necessary to being accepted to law school? Any ideas? Anyone? Bueller? So, we talked about it earlier, right? Applying to law school would be necessary to being accepted to law school, right? If you didn't apply, right, you can't get accepted. Anna Ruthless, you said LSAT. It's technically not true anymore, right? It used to be the case, but now 25% of schools accepted GRE in lieu of the LSAT. So it's not actually, that wouldn't be the case anymore. That would have been the case in the past, absolutely, right? If you didn't take the LSAT, you couldn't get into law school, although we have seen some for-profit, low-ranked law schools that will let anybody in, whether you've taken the LSAT or not, and obviously we would not recommend going to those. But the idea is, you notice, applying is not going to get you into law school, right? Taking the LSAT is not going to get you into law school. Those aren't sufficient, right? They're not sufficient, but they're necessary. So you see, you really want to think about necessary as the minimum, the floor, right? You have to apply. You used to have to take the LSAT, right? Generally, you still do have to take the LSAT, but it's not 100%, so you wouldn't technically be required, right? But now let's look at it from the other side of the equation, right? What is sufficient to get accepted to law school, right? You know, and so, like, you know, some examples here. I don't think GPA is, you know, having a GPA, I mean, is definitely necessary because you have to have a BA, right? So yes, you would have to have a GPA. Absolutely. That's necessary, right? Because it's part of the requirement of having a BA, right? Work experience is not a requirement. You don't have to have a work experience to go to law school, right? So it wouldn't even be a necessary condition. And none of these are going to be sufficient, right? Because everybody here has all of these things, right? So it's harder to think about it when you think about, okay, what would be sufficient for me getting into law school, right? You could hire Rick Singer, right? Maybe your dad donates a $10 million building. Those might work, right? But in, you know, jokes aside, I think scoring a 180, right, would probably be considered sufficient to get you into law school. I think, technically anything above 172 would probably be sufficient to get you into law school. Well, see, now again, like, having been an attorney, again, you don't have to go to law school to be an attorney. Don't forget about Kim Kardashian out there, right? She's out there trying to become an attorney without going to law school, right? Because in California, you can become an attorney without going to law school. You have to become an apprentice for an attorney. It's a longer process than the 3 years of law school, but it is possible, right? And so, again, floor ceiling is, I think, a good example, right? You have to apply. You have to, Love Anna, don't worry if you're losing service. This will be available for replay, not only on Instagram for the next 24 hours, but we'll get it on YouTube afterwards. So don't worry, everyone can come back and rewatch it. And so that's, I think, really a good example. Now, if we wanted to come to the example that I use in the course and bring it to the modern day world, because I'm assuming most of you guys don't even know who Scottie Pippen is anymore, we could say something like Kawhi Leonard is a great basketball player, right? Okay. So what is necessary for Kawhi Leonard being a great basketball player? Is it winning championships? There's a bunch of great basketball players that have never won championships, right? Charles Barkley, Karl Malone, right? Practicing is definitely not going to be, unless you're Allen Iverson, but he didn't win a championship, so maybe it is. Maybe it is necessary. Maybe practice is necessary, right? I think he needs arms. I think someone's taken LSAT Max, right? Absolutely, because again, notice that's the floor. Without arms, how could you be a great basketball player, right? It's not possible, right? So yes, absolutely, he would have to have arms. Eyes would also work, right? I'm assuming you can't be a great basketball player. Legs would also work, right? At least in the NBA, right? Obviously, you do see some leagues for people with disabilities, right? But I'm talking about in terms of professional basketball player, absolutely you would need legs, right? And that, yeah, sufficient is much stronger. So it's much harder, again, to come up with something that you could think, oh, you know, what's sufficient for being a great basketball player? Because obviously there's a lot of different resumes that have led people to be considered great basketball players. But I think you really want to think sufficient as the extreme, right? Saying something really extreme that makes everyone say, wow, that guy has to be great. Like Kawhi Leonard took Canada to the championship. Man must be great, right? Canada won a championship because of the man. So now let's see if he does it with the Clippers. I think that would also be a great example, right? So I think that's the way you want to think about it. You're absolutely right. Sufficient, again, remember, star boy. Sufficient is not just something. It's something that leads you to something else, right? It invokes the condition to allow you to arrive at a conclusion with 100% certainty, right? So I think that's a really important way to think about it. Whereas necessary, right, as it implies, is required, right? It's required. And that's the whole idea of the negation technique, right? Where you eliminate the necessary condition. If something is required and I remove it, right, the argument is destroyed. Right? So like, for example, if I said Kawhi Leonard is a great basketball player and the answer choice said Kawhi Leonard has arms, that would be the correct answer, because when I negate that, Kawhi Leonard doesn't have arms or doesn't necessarily have arms, right? That would destroy the argument that he's a great basketball player, right? Okay, I was told during an LSAT course that if you do not get this, you will not do well on the exam. Well, again, so like when we say get the sufficient and necessary principles down, guys, it's really not that complicated, right? This is not the barber's paradox or, really difficult logic. This is basic formal logic, right? Conditional statement, contrapositive, so positive argument structure, contrapositive argument structure, transitive property, right? It's nothing that we shouldn't be able to get a grasp on, right? It just obviously is going to take some time. It's going to take some memorization. Again, there's not a lot of things that we memorize on the LSAT, but the rules of sufficient and necessary are one of those things. So I think, spending the time to commit these things to memory is a really, really good idea as you obviously progress here with your LSAT prep. Well, should doesn't introduce conditional language, so no. The answer would definitely be no, right? I think it's, yeah. I mean, if should is a prescriptive argument, right? It's saying I should do something. It's not the same idea of conditional language, right? Okay. Is it worth going to law school if you don't practice? Fantastic question. Nothing to do with sufficient and necessary, though, but we'll make an exception, Natalie. I think it depends on the school. Yeah. Obviously, I think, the degree is flexible. It really changes the way you think, as I'm sure you're noticing as you prepare for the LSAT, right? Obviously, that's going to stick with you throughout life. I think the issue is, you definitely don't want to go take, you don't want to do something that's not going to make sense from an economic perspective, right? So borrowing a ton of money for, an education that won't help you repay it, right? I don't think Harvard Law would be considered that. Even taking out debt, right? I think it's a no-brainer. And obviously the beauty of Harvard Law is, they have need-based scholarships, so no merit-based. So if you can't afford to pay for it, they will give you scholarships. And then they also have the low-income protection program, which I think is also great. And, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, Harvard Law School has this thing where based on your salary when you graduate, they repay your loans for you. So it gives you the flexibility to go pursue other careers that might not necessarily be corporate law, right? All right. Doherty, how do you reduce ambiguity? So the best way to reduce the ambiguity is be able to extract the formal logic, right? Again, going back to this example that we had here, where these are all the same logical sentence, right? And just being able to realize that and extract the pure logic, because if I can diagram this correctly, if I can get from here to here, right? I'm in great shape, because when I'm here in this vacuum where I know that I've diagrammed this correctly, I can then say, okay, I know my positive argument structure and I know my contrapositive argument structure. So I think the uncertainty comes from getting from this place to here, right? And that's the one thing that I always, I find strange. I think students might be overthinking it, right? Our missing premise drills, our argument completion drills, they're vacuums, right? We're doing it in a vacuum, where we've already extracted the logic for you. So we're just 2 plus 2 is 4, right? And so that's the thing. You know, I think it's really just about getting it memorized. And listen, I think, you know, it's natural to be confused when you start. If you're talking about LSAT Max, if you're talking about your LSAT Max experience with sufficient and necessary condition, I would like to point out a couple of things. One, we do it on purpose. Okay, we throw you into the fire in that homework assignment for a reason. We want you to know that you don't understand sufficient and necessary the way you need to. Because anybody who does is going to breeze through those questions, right? Hutchinson, well, listen, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't think there is one. Well, you know, fee waiver scholarship makes it entirely free. So that would be a sufficient condition to getting a free course. Military, if you're military, it's half price. We also have the no interest payment plans. So definitely check it out. Are sufficient necessary conditions more common in some types of logic games than others? Absolutely, Ellie. They are more common in group games. We talked about this last week when we went over the difference between not both, either or. If you missed it, make sure you jump on YouTube and watch the replay, because you definitely want to be comfortable with sufficient and necessary conditions and the transitive property, right? We talked about, there's some group games out there where all of the rules are sufficient and necessary conditions. All we want to do is diagram them, write the contrapositives, and move on to the questions, because as the questions invoke sufficient conditions, we're going to follow the arrows and make the deductions, right? And yes, of course, these will all be available on YouTube, guys. So if you had to leave early or you jumped in late, or you just want to rewatch it because you thought it's helpful, absolutely. These will be available, so don't worry about that. And so, how to know when and when not to diagram statements. So Hassan, I think the key there is they're conditional statements. If then, right? Now, obviously the keyword indicators is the best place to start. So the problem with reading comp, I'm happy to do a Q&A on reading comp. I just don't know what we would talk about for an hour, but absolutely. So I think, obviously the things we haven't done yet that are definitely coming, we will be doing one on logical reasoning. We'll be doing one on reading comp. Anything else you guys want us to talk about, please don't hesitate to reach out, right? You can send us messages directly on Instagram. You can obviously reach out to us from chat in the app or our email. So please, guys, don't hesitate. We're here for you. We're here to do the things that you find helpful, because that's what we're about. We're just about providing value to our students. And so I think as we get to the end here, a couple of things that I want to emphasize that are coming up here. Obviously, the change date for the September LSAT is August 21st, I want to say. So if you are not feeling comfortable, you feel like you might need some more time to improve your score into your target score range, there's nothing wrong with postponing till October or November, right? I understand rolling admissions. Trust me, I am aware of it. I was all about applying early too, but what matters more is having the score that you're going to need to get into the schools that you're interested in, right? So if you're not hitting your target score on your simulated practice LSATs, I would highly recommend considering postponing and giving yourself a little bit more time. And obviously, if you want us to chat with you about any of these decisions or questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Again, you can text LSAT to 310-818-7743, and we're happy to chat with you guys. And again, there's no charge for us talking with you, so don't not reach out because you think we're going to charge you. And again, make sure you download LSAT Max if you haven't. This is what the app looks like. All colored icons are free content. It includes daily drills, which will definitely reinforce some of the stuff we talked about today with sufficient and necessary. And then obviously we have digital LSAT simulated with practice LSATs by LSAT Max. Couple other quick things before we run out of time here, because we're coming up on 5 minutes. We will be launching a new contest. It is going to be an LSAT Max photo contest. The idea being, while our students using our competitors are stuck in a class, while it's beautiful and summer outside, students who are using LSAT Max can go anywhere they want. And so the contest is very simple. Show us how you take advantage of the convenience of LSAT Max take a photo of yourself using it somewhere, right? And post it onto social media and tag us. We're going to put the exact instructions on our feed, right? So you'll know exactly what to do. And we'll share an example of when we did it for Bar Max, the winner of the Bar Max contest to give you some inspiration. And the winner is going to get a free tablet, either iPad or Android tablet. Runner-up will be 1 month subscription to LSAT Max. And then we will be giving away some shirts and digital LSAT prep tests to other people who enter. So everyone will have a chance at winning those. But grand prize will be selected by us, and the second prize as well. But the number of likes you get will help us, because obviously if you take a great photo and gets a lot of likes, we will consider that. So check out our feed for some more information about that contest. Now, turning to something a little bit more serious before I let you guys go. So it was recently brought to our attention that some of our students were having their posts censored and their accounts banned for mentioning LSAT Max on various internet message boards out there. And obviously we found this to be very disturbing. So we went undercover, and sadly we confirmed that the reports were true. And so I think what we want to do today is end it with a public service announcement about the stuff that you see out there on the internet, right? Because as you prepare for the LSAT, right, you're learning how to think critically, right? It's going to help you through, the LSAT. It's going to help you in law school. It's going to help you as a practicing attorney, right? But it's also going to help you in real life, because sadly our world is filled with logical fallacies, half-truths, and misrepresentations, right? So when you're out there and you're looking around on the internet and you find something that tries to recommend LSAT resources to you, I would really take a moment and pause and just try to think critically about it, right? Because the sad reality is there's a lot of hacks out there who don't have your best interest in mind and will mislead you by censoring information that will be useful to you. And if you're wondering how you can identify these hacks, I think we can go over some examples that I think will really resonate. A few years back, I remember somebody wrote an article about the best LSAT prep apps. And this article listed a bunch of apps, and it didn't list LSAT Max. Now listen, it's possible that the person who wrote that article decided to write the article without even going into the App Store and searching LSAT, right? It's possible, right? Especially when we know about the news media, I think it's possible, right? But I feel the far more likely scenario is that author didn't want his readers to know about LSAT Max, right? Because if you look, our app has been around the longest. It has over 1,000 5-star reviews right now. And so it's strange for someone who's writing an objective article about best LSAT prep apps to not include LSAT Max, right? Another example is if you go out on the internet and you find a list of LSAT resources, right? And it doesn't list LSAT Max, right? That would be a major red flag for me, because I promise you we've reached out to them and tried to get them to include us, right? And then you should ask yourself, why wouldn't they include LSAT Max? What is it? Is it the free trial that we give all this free content, that we're constantly doing more free content like these Instagram lives, right? Is it our fee waiver scholarship that makes the course free for students who can't afford LSAT prep? Is it the military scholarship, right? Is it because we give lifetime access? We only use 99th percentile LSAT instructors? Is it because, we can simulate the digital LSAT? We're one of the most innovative LSAT prep companies out there, right? And so I think what you'll start to realize is that the reason that you don't see us places is because the people who are in charge of those things are biased, right? Maybe they have a financial interest in promoting other courses, right? Maybe they have a financial interest in protecting their own LSAT prep offerings, because as you know, it's very hard to compete with what LSAT Max offers. And I think that is really what's happening here. And unfortunately, it's nothing new for the test prep industry, right? If you look, when we launched Bar Max, right, there's a TechCrunch article about how we scared one of the biggest competitors into changing their product offerings because just our presence forced our competitors to try to be better, right? They had to compete because of our presence, right? And not surprisingly, what you see is a lot of these companies entering into exclusive arrangements with law schools and pre-law societies, pre-law clubs, to prevent students from having information, right? And so I just wanted to make sure that you guys are aware of that stuff, right? And the beauty of LSAT Max is, listen, you guys have my cell phone number. If you have a free account, you have my cell phone number. So if you have any questions, if you have any concerns about anything, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at any time, right? As the saying goes, you can call me on my cell phone. All right, guys, I really enjoyed it. I'll see you guys in a couple weeks.